something happened today that deserves careful attention. Not because it is complex, but because once you see it clearly, it becomes almost uncomfortably simple. The problem is that most coverage will likely pull your attention in other directions. You will hear about political moves in Washington, cancel diplomatic trips, seize vessels, and shifting ceasefire language. All of that is real, but it is not the center of gravity. There is a single sentence that came through Iranian state-linked media today that changes how this moment should be understood. It came from the commander of the IRGC Aerospace Force, and it was directed straight at Iran's Gulf neighbors, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain. The statement was not vague. It was not symbolic. It was precise enough to be unsettling. If their land or facilities are used by enemies to attack Iran, they should say goodbye to oil production in the Middle East region. That line was published through Iran's state-affiliated news channels alongside full context this morning, April 22nd, 2026. And what followed is even more important than the sentence itself. Iran's target list has now expanded beyond military installations. It now includes major oil infrastructure across the entire Gulf region. This is where the situation shifts from political messaging to operational signaling. The IRGC Aerospace Command did not speak in abstractions. It named facilities. It listed infrastructure. It identified specific industrial sites that together process millions of barrels of oil every day. This includes major complexes in Saudi Arabia, such as the Manifa oil plant with nearly 1 million barrels per day capacity, the Seatorp refinery handling hundreds of thousands of barrels daily, and the Yanbu complex on the Red Sea coast. It also extends to facilities in Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE, including refineries, LNG hubs, and storage terminals that sit at the center of global energy flows. These are not symbolic references. These are coordinates, industrial realities, and physical points on a map that global energy markets depend on every day. When a military command publishes that level of specificity, it is not improvisation. It is signaling that targeting analysis exists, that planning has been done, and that the only remaining variable is decision-making. The condition attached to this threat is also important, and it is not theoretical. The IRGC stated that if Gulf states allow their territory or infrastructure to be used by Iran's adversaries, then the consequences will follow. And in practical terms, that condition is already being met. American forces are present across multiple Gulf states. The U.S. Fifth Fleet operates from Bahrain. Air operations and intelligence coordination involve bases in Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE. In recent months, military activity linked to strikes on Iran has been routed through regional infrastructure. From Tehran's perspective, the condition they described is not hypothetical. It is already active. What remains uncertain is whether Iran chooses to act on it. Timing matters as well. This statement did not appear at the beginning of escalation. It came after a series of developments: a ceasefire extension with no clear endpoint, naval seizures by the United States, retaliatory drone activity, and continued maritime tensions in and around the region. Each step has added pressure, and each step has increased the stakes. So what we are seeing is not a starting point. It is another step on a ladder of escalation that has been climbing since early 2026, with each stage more explicit than the last. And while most of the attention will focus on what Iran said, the more important question may be what others did not say in response. Because silence, in this case, is not absence. It is information. What makes this moment more important than the threat itself is the reaction. Or more precisely, the lack of reaction from one of the most influential external players in the region. China has said nothing publicly about Iran's direct warning to Gulf oil infrastructure. No statement from its foreign ministry. No diplomatic comment urging restraint directed at Tehran. No visible effort to publicly distance itself from the language or the implication of targeting energy facilities that supply the global market. And that silence is not background noise. It is the second half of the story. Because to understand why it matters, you first have to understand what the IRGC's statement actually represents beyond headlines. Too much of the early coverage will likely treat it as rhetorical escalation, another round of strong language in a long-running confrontation. But this statement differs from earlier ones in three key ways that change its meaning. First, it is specific. Earlier Iranian messaging in this conflict referred broadly to Gulf energy infrastructure, shipping routes, or regional economic pressure points. This time, the language changed. It names individual facilities, the Manifa oil plant in Saudi Arabia, the Bapco refinery in Bahrain, the Al Ahmadi refinery in Kuwait, LNG infrastructure in Qatar, storage hubs in the UAE. Specificity matters because it removes ambiguity. It transforms a general warning into a defined map of potential targets. When military institutions begin naming infrastructure at that level of detail, it signals that identification work has already been done. It implies preparation rather than speculation. Second, the condition is clearly defined and already active. The IRGC tied consequences directly to Gulf states, allowing their territory or infrastructure to be used by Iran's adversaries. In practical terms, this refers primarily to the United States and its regional military presence. And this is not a future scenario. It is an ongoing reality. U.S. forces are stationed across the Gulf, operating from bases in Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE, with maritime operations coordinated through the Fifth Fleet. From Tehran's perspective, the condition they stated is not something that might happen later. It is something they believe is already happening now. Third, the timing of the statement is critical. It comes after a sequence of escalatory steps. The extension of a ceasefire without resolution, U.S. naval seizures of commercial vessels, retaliatory drone activity directed at American forces, and ongoing maritime pressure in strategic waterways. This is not the first signal in a crisis. It is part of a continuing chain of escalation, where each step has expanded the scope of what is considered acceptable or possible. That is why the statement is being taken seriously in strategic circles, even if public coverage reduces it to rhetoric. Because when threats move from general language to named infrastructure, they are no longer just warnings. They are signals of operational framing. And while that alone would be enough to dominate the regional security discussion, the silence from China introduces a second layer that is shaping how Gulf states interpret everything. China is not a peripheral actor here. It is the largest buyer of Iranian crude oil. It is a major investor across Gulf economies. It is also the only external power that maintains a functional economic bridge between Iran and the global market under current sanctions pressure. So when China says nothing in response to a direct Iranian threat against Gulf oil infrastructure, that silence is not neutral. It is structurally meaningful. It tells regional governments something very specific without ever stating it outright, that China is not positioning itself as a guarantor of Gulf security in the event of escalation. It is not signaling that it will intervene diplomatically in a decisive way if Iran acts on its warnings. It is not taking ownership of the risk environment that is now emerging. Instead, it is maintaining economic continuity with Iran while avoiding public entanglement in the consequences. And for Gulf states, that distinction is becoming increasingly important because it reframes how they understand the balance of external influence in the region. They are not only dealing with American military presence and Iranian escalation, they're also operating in an environment where China, despite its economic weight, is choosing not to insert itself into the security equation that directly affects their core infrastructure. To understand why China's silence is becoming such a central factor in this situation, you have to look at how the other major external actors are positioning themselves in parallel, because while China is not speaking, Russia is not only speaking, it is actively structuring its role in the background in a very deliberate way. Earlier today, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov held a direct call with Iran's foreign minister. The official readouts from both sides describe the conversation in slightly different language, but the core message was consistent. Russia confirmed what it called its unwavering readiness to assist in resolving the crisis. At the same time, Iran's side emphasized cooperation and coordination on broader regional issues, including maritime security. But the most revealing part of the exchange was not the diplomatic language. It was what was exchanged in practical terms. According to Iranian state media, Iran confirmed a readiness to guarantee unimpeded passage for Russian vessels through the Strait of Hormuz. In return, Russia reaffirmed its political backing for Iran's position and its continued engagement as a partner in managing the broader regional escalation. This is not a symbolic diplomatic handshake. It is a functional arrangement tied directly to global energy routes. What matters here is that Russia is not acting as a neutral mediator. It is positioning itself as a strategic participant with material benefits embedded in both outcomes of the conflict. If tensions escalate and oil prices rise due to instability in the Gulf, Russia benefits economically through increased energy revenue. If stability returns and maritime routes are secured under negotiated conditions, Russia still benefits politically by being seen as a stabilizing intermediary. In both scenarios, it maintains leverage and gains. Recent data already reflects this dynamic. Russian oil revenues have surged significantly in recent months as global energy prices respond to uncertainty in the Strait of Hormuz. This is not accidental. It is structural. Russia's economy is indirectly linked to the very instability this conflict is generating. So while China is silent in maintaining economic engagement without public positioning, Russia is actively shaping its role through selective engagement that maximizes strategic advantage regardless of how the conflict develops. This creates a triangle of influence that is shaping the entire environment. Iran, Russia, and China, each playing different roles, but all indirectly affecting the same pressure system that surrounds the Gulf states. And that pressure system is where the real implications begin to emerge. Because on the other side of this triangle sit the Gulf countries themselves. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain. These are not passive observers. They are deeply embedded in the structure of this conflict in ways that make neutrality extremely difficult. Each of these states hosts or coordinates with American military assets. The U.S. Fifth Fleet operates out of Bahrain. Air operations and logistical coordination span multiple bases across Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE. These arrangements are not temporary. They are foundational to Gulf security architecture. At the same time, these countries are now directly named in Iran's expanded target list for energy infrastructure, not as general references, but as specific facilities tied to production, refining, and export capacity. That combination creates an immediate structural tension. On one side, their security is tied to American military presence. On the other, that same presence is now explicitly linked by Iran to potential retaliation against their economic infrastructure. And this is where the situation becomes strategically difficult rather than simply dangerous. Because Gulf states are not free actors in the pure sense often assumed in external commentary. Their defense systems, air protection, intelligence integration, and naval security are deeply interwoven with American capability. Removing that structure is not a realistic option in the short term, but remaining fully within it now carries a visible cost because it places their core economic infrastructure inside a declared escalation framework. So they are left in a constrained position. Not choosing between two sides, but managing exposure between two forces that are both shaping their risk environment. This is also why Saudi Arabia, in particular, has been increasing diplomatic pressure on Washington behind the scenes. Reports indicate that Riyadh has been pushing for adjustments in U.S. policy related to the blockade and broader containment strategy, not because of alignment with Iran, but because continued escalation increases direct risk to Saudi oil infrastructure, especially major sites like Ras Tanura and Manifa. The logic is not ideological. It is structural risk management. And this is where China's silence becomes even more relevant, because in this triangle of influence, China is the only external actor with significant economic leverage over Iran that is not using that leverage publicly in response to escalation. It continues purchasing Iranian crude. It continues engaging economically across the Gulf, but it does not intervene in the security dimension of the crisis. When you step back from individual statements and diplomatic calls, what begins to emerge is not a series of isolated decisions, but a layered structure of pressure where every actor is responding to incentives that are increasingly misaligned. At the center of this structure is Iran's escalation ladder, which has been building step by step since the early phases of this conflict. What makes this ladder important is not just that Iran is escalating, but how each step has been normalized by the absence of a strong, unified external response. Earlier phases involved disruptions to maritime traffic and limited strikes or demonstrations of capability. Those were treated as contained signals. Then came more direct actions involving drones and naval interactions, followed by temporary ceasefires that did not fully reset tensions. Each phase created a new baseline. Now, the baseline includes something much more explicit: the naming of civilian energy infrastructure as potential targets. That shift matters because it changes the nature of deterrence. When infrastructure is unnamed, there is ambiguity. When it is listed, the ambiguity disappears. And once ambiguity disappears, decision-making becomes binary. Either the threat is credible enough to change behavior, or it is not. Iran has now moved into a phase where credibility is being tested through specificity. But the more important question is why Iran believes it can operate at this level of escalation without triggering a decisive external counter response. And this is where the broader geopolitical environment becomes essential. China's role is not active intervention, but sustained economic engagement. Iranian crude continues flowing into China through sanction evasion logistics systems involving ship-to-ship transfers, transponder manipulation, and alternative payment channels outside the traditional financial system. Despite sanctions pressure, significant volumes of oil still reach Chinese markets. This creates a financial buffer for Iran. It does not eliminate pressure, but it prevents collapse. And that distinction is critical because it changes how escalation is calculated internally in Tehran. If economic survival is not immediately threatened, then military or strategic escalation becomes more tolerable as a tool of negotiation or leverage. In other words, the cost of escalation is partially absorbed externally. At the same time, Russia's position adds another layer of complexity. Russia benefits indirectly from instability in global energy markets. Higher oil prices improve Russian fiscal conditions, especially under existing sanctions. So while Russia presents itself as a diplomatic actor, it also benefits from the economic consequences of continued tension. This does not mean coordination in a formal sense. It means alignment of incentives. Different actors benefiting from different outcomes within the same system of instability. And sitting inside this structure are the Gulf states, which are now directly exposed to named risk. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain are not peripheral participants. They are structurally embedded in both the military and economic dimensions of this conflict. American military presence provides security guarantees, but it also places their infrastructure within the potential response framework of Iran's escalation logic. This is why the IRGC statement is so significant. It does not simply threaten retaliation. It ties retaliation to specific infrastructure that is essential to global energy supply. That means any action would not remain localized. It would immediately become a global economic shock. Facilities like Ras Tanura, Manifa, Jubail, Bapco, and LNG hubs in Qatar are not just national assets. They are nodes in the global energy system. Disruption to any of them would ripple through pricing, supply chains, and industrial stability worldwide. So the Gulf states are operating in a constrained environment where every option carries cost. Maintaining alignment with the United States ensures military protection but increases exposure to Iranian targeting logic. Attempting neutrality does not remove them from the equation because their geography and infrastructure already place them within it. And shifting alignment is not structurally realistic in the short term, given the depth of existing defense integration. This is why Saudi Arabia's diplomatic activity has become more visible. Its engagement with Washington is not simply about alliance management. It is about trying to reduce the probability that its infrastructure becomes a direct node in an escalating exchange. The UAE is pursuing a similar balancing approach, maintaining economic openness with China while also relying on American security guarantees. Kuwait continues its historically cautious positioning, consistently advocating de-escalation. Qatar remains in a uniquely complex position, simultaneously hosting major U.S. military infrastructure, acting as a mediator, and managing one of the most strategically important LNG hubs in the world. Each state is adapting differently, but all are responding to the same underlying reality. The risk environment is now explicitly tied to named infrastructure rather than abstract regional instability. And in the background of all of this, China remains silent on the specific threat that changes the equation most directly. Not absent from the region, not disengaged economically, but absent from the security response layer that would normally accompany a crisis of this magnitude. As this situation continues to develop, the most important shift is not happening on the battlefield, or even in official statements. It is happening in how regional actors are recalculating risk under conditions where every external influence is behaving differently, yet all are shaping the same pressure environment. At this stage, Iran's position is no longer defined only by military capability or political messaging. It is defined by perceived endurance. The key question inside Tehran is not whether escalation is possible, but whether escalation remains survivable under current economic and diplomatic conditions. That survivability is strongly influenced by external flows, particularly oil revenue channels that remain partially intact despite sanctions. Chinese purchases of Iranian crude continue to function as the primary stabilizing mechanism. Even when shipments are rerouted, discounted, or transferred through indirect maritime networks, the revenue stream does not fully collapse. It is reduced, fragmented, but still active. That matters because it changes internal calculations. If economic pressure does not reach a breaking point, then escalation can be sustained longer without immediate systemic failure. That does not guarantee escalation, but it increases the range of options available to decision makers. At the same time, the Gulf states are watching this dynamic unfold while sitting directly in the projected zone of potential retaliation. Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure is not theoretical in this discussion. Facilities like Ras Tanura and Manifa are explicitly named in Iranian-linked messaging. These are not symbolic references. They are operational assets that handle a significant portion of global energy supply. Any disruption would not remain regional. It would immediately affect global pricing and industrial stability. The UAE faces a similar structure of exposure. Its refining and storage infrastructure, along with key logistical ports like Fujairah, sit within the same mapped risk environment. Qatar's LNG production, which supplies a large portion of global demand, is also part of this framework. Kuwait's refining capacity and Bahrain's Bapco infrastructure are equally embedded. What ties all of these together is not just geography, but dependency. Each of these states relies on continuous operation of these facilities for economic stability. That means the threat is not abstract. It is directly connected to national revenue systems. And layered on top of this is the presence of American military infrastructure. The U.S. Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, air operations in Qatar, logistics and intelligence coordination across Kuwait and the UAE all form part of a security network that has existed for decades. That network is not easily removed or replaced, which means it continues to shape how Iran defines potential targets. From Iran's perspective, the presence of US forces in these locations is not separate from Gulf state infrastructure. It is integrated into the same operational environment. That is why the IRGC statement does not distinguish sharply between American assets and regional economic infrastructure. It treats them as part of a single strategic system. This is also why Gulf states are increasingly focused on de-escalation efforts. Saudi Arabia's diplomatic engagement with Washington is not about abandoning alliances. It is about trying to reduce the probability that existing alliance structures become triggers for direct economic retaliation. The UAE's position reflects a similar logic, maintaining strong security ties with the United States while simultaneously deepening economic relationships with China. This dual-track approach is not contradictory from their perspective. It is a form of risk distribution. Kuwait continues to emphasize restraint and mediation, consistent with its historical foreign policy approach. Qatar remains uniquely positioned as both a host of major U.S. military infrastructure and a key mediator in regional negotiations, while also managing one of the most strategically important LNG export systems in the world. Each state is essentially trying to slow down the escalation curve in a system they cannot fully control. And that brings the focus back to the external powers shaping the environment from different angles. Russia continues to operate within a framework that aligns economic benefit with strategic engagement. It gains from higher energy prices, maintains diplomatic relevance, and secures operational assurances like guaranteed passage through key maritime routes. China, however, remains the most structurally significant silent actor. It continues to purchase Iranian oil, continues to engage economically across the Gulf, and continues to support general diplomatic language around de-escalation. But it does not engage publicly on the specific threat to Gulf infrastructure. That absence is now interpreted regionally, not as neutrality, but as a boundary condition. It signals where China's priorities end: economic stability and trade continuity, rather than active security enforcement in regional military disputes. And that is why Gulf states are recalibrating their understanding of the external environment. They are not simply assessing who supports whom, they are assessing who is willing to absorb costs in order to prevent escalation. In that calculation, the United States provides military structure but limited escalation appetite. Russia benefits from instability but does not intervene to stop it. China maintains economic continuity but avoids security involvement. This leaves the Gulf states in a position where they are structurally protected, economically exposed, and diplomatically surrounded by actors with different incentives. That is the environment in which the IRGC's statement exists, not as an isolated threat, but as part of a wider system where responses are fragmented and influence is distributed unevenly across military, economic, and diplomatic layers. At this point, the situation is no longer defined by a single statement or even a single escalation. It is defined by how all the moving parts interact without ever fully aligning into a coordinated response. And that lack of alignment is exactly what makes the current moment so unstable. Iran has now moved into a phase where its messaging is no longer just about deterrence in general terms. It is about mapping consequences onto specific infrastructure. That shift from abstract warnings to named facilities changes how every regional actor interprets risk. It removes distance from the conflict. It brings it directly into the economic core of the Gulf states. But what makes this moment structurally different is not only what Iran has said, it is what has not happened in response. China's silence continues to stand out because of its position in the system. It is not a minor economic partner. It is the largest buyer of Iranian oil. It is deeply invested across Gulf economies. It is a central node in global energy demand. And yet, in the face of explicit threats to Gulf infrastructure, it has chosen not to publicly engage. That silence is now being interpreted in practical terms by regional governments, not as agreement with Iran's position, but as a clear signal of non-intervention in security terms. China will maintain economic ties. It will continue trade. It will continue diplomatic language around de-escalation, but it is not signaling that it will actively step into a crisis to restrain Iran if escalation crosses a threshold. That distinction matters more than any formal statement could. Because in a system where deterrence depends not only on capability, but also on perceived external restraint, absence of intervention becomes part of the equation. Russia's role reinforces this dynamic from a different angle. It remains engaged diplomatically, but it also benefits economically from sustained tension in global energy markets. Higher prices support its fiscal position. Maritime agreements and political alignment with Iran secure its access routes and strategic positioning. In effect, Russia is embedded in the system in a way that allows it to gain from multiple outcomes. So the Gulf states are not operating in a vacuum of threats. They are operating in a structured environment where each major external actor has a different incentive. The United States provides security, but is cautious about escalation. Russia benefits from instability, but does not absorb the cost of stopping it. China maintains economic continuity, but avoids security commitments tied to conflict resolution. And Iran operates within that structure, testing limits step by step, calculating how far escalation can go, without triggering unified opposition. This is where the confidence ladder becomes visible in practice. Each stage of escalation that does not produce a decisive counter-response becomes a reference point for the next. Over time, this creates a new baseline for what is considered possible. We have already seen this progression. Maritime disruptions were absorbed, limited strikes and drone activity were contained. Ceasefire extensions were accepted despite unresolved conditions. Vessel seizures and retaliatory responses did not escalate into full-scale retaliation. Each event reset expectations slightly higher than before. Now, the discussion has moved to named oil infrastructure. That is not just escalation in rhetoric. It is escalation in definition. It draws a direct line between political conditions and physical assets that underpin the global economy. For Gulf states, this is the most sensitive point in the entire structure. Their economies are not diversified away from oil infrastructure at the scale required to absorb disruption. Their national stability is directly tied to continuous production and export. That means any credible threat to those systems is not just a foreign policy issue. It is an internal economic risk. At the same time, their security architecture cannot be easily separated from American military presence. Bases, fleets, intelligence systems, and air defense coordination are deeply integrated into their defense structures. That integration is long-standing and not easily reversible. So they remain in the constrained position, not choosing between alliances, but managing exposure within an existing structure that is now under stress. This is why Saudi Arabia's diplomatic activity has intensified. It is not shifting alliances. It is attempting to reduce the probability of direct infrastructure targeting by pushing for adjustments in broader policy frameworks. It is risk containment, not realignment. The UAE is doing something similar through economic diversification of partnerships, including deeper engagement with China, while still relying on American security guarantees. Kuwait continues to prioritize de-escalation as its primary diplomatic objective. Qatar maintains its dual role as both mediator and host of critical infrastructure, trying to keep channels open on all sides while avoiding direct entanglement. Each state is adapting, but none of them are operating with full control over the variables that matter most. And that brings everything back to the central structural reality of this moment. The threat is no longer hypothetical. The infrastructure is identified. The escalation pathway is visible. The external responses are fragmented. And the actors with the most influence over Iran's economic resilience are not engaging directly with the security dimension of the crisis. That is the core issue. Not just what was said today by Iran's IRGC Aerospace Command, but the system around it. A system where escalation is becoming more defined, but restraint is not becoming more coordinated. And in that gap between definition and coordination, the risk continues to accumulate quietly. even when most of the world is looking elsewhere.